You were actually the first person I heard that was speaking out and said, hey, I don't think we should be doing this to children.
You're circumventing their healthy sexual development into adulthood.
When the judge didn't do what every other judge in American history typically does when the DOJ drops the case, I mean, we knew something was up.
We have too many agencies trying to protect their paychecks and pensions and not willing to tell the truth, Nicole.
You have to have faith in the human spirit, the human soul, and the God that is within and above and moving through it.
We are all reflections of God's light and God's consciousness.
There's more than just the physical world. We're more than bags of meat running into other bags of meat. And in that sense, Nicole, we do matter more than we are matter.
I'm Nicole Shanahan. Welcome to Back to the People podcast, which highlights the growth of a movement uniting America, where our government is free from corporate capture and where we give voice back to the American public. Lori and Mike Flynn, thank you so much for joining me. And together, I think this is really special because
first time.
Well, and Valentine's Day was a few days ago, and your love story it's beautiful, it's admirable, it's powerful. It's something that we should all aim for. You have been serving our nation. You had been serving our nation for decades. You served as Director of Intelligence for Joint Special Operations Command. You were the 18th Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. You have been laser focused on intelligence in the military, which is a very unique role. Okay, as we're looking at, and I want to hear both of your opinions because, Lori, you have been by his side since you guys were kids.
Right.
And both of you patriots, both of you love our nation. And you saw what seemed like a pretty standard military career, an impressive military career, turn into a nightmare over a period of time. What was that first conversation like when you came home and you're like, Lori, there's something going on?
Yeah. I mean, I'll start and then Lori can jump in because she and I live this thing together. We had an amazing career in the military, both of us, and we just, enjoyed all the people. We enjoyed especially the people, but we enjoyed all the assignments that we were at. A lot of deployments, a lot of combat experience and operations that I was involved in for many, many years. A lot of separations, a lot of, Lori raising the kids kind of thing, and that happens to a lot of people in the military, especially if you're in like these high-end military units that do a lot of deploying. And we spent more than half of our career at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is it's home of special operations, home of the airborne, a very elite, and I hate to use that word because every one of our soldiers and sailors, airmen, Marines, they do elite things. But, it's a place where you do a lot of stuff and you get asked to do a lot of stuff, in many places around the world. And my career did. And then all of a sudden I get out after, almost 3.5 decades of service, and 5 of those years were in direct combat operations. And, I start to have another life. We start to have another life. You get into business and all sorts of other stuff. And I came in touch with Donald Trump, and he was asking me for my expertise on various things. As I said in the movie, actually a lot of other presidential candidates reached out at that time. Funny thing was I was a Democrat and it was all Republicans that reached out. So what gives? But and I think that at that time we were like, okay, we're going to continue to serve the country, whatever their calling is, right? In this case, it was political. But then once we went into the White House, because I'm fast forwarding through a lot of stuff, once we went into the White House, then all of a sudden it was like, wow. And things started to even before I went in, things started to change. And she probably felt it even more than I did because I'm busy trying to do the business of government and trying to do the things that in this case, President-elect Trump and then President Trump wanted to do. And looking back on it, I was being undermined not only by the previous administration, the Obama administration, in a very
Obama on his way out. Says
and
to Trump, watch out for Flynn.
Right. And also it's come out in the, in subsequent reports like the Durham report, a very famous meeting that Obama held in the Oval Office on the 5th of January of 2017. It's all documented. The evidence most of the evidence has been revealed. I expect Pam Bondi and Kash Patel to reveal even more because a lot of it's redacted stuff. And it's really egregious. It's sedition, or treason, it's whatever you want to call it, which are really strong words. But it happened, and it's the reality. So all that was happening, but I also learned later on that I was undermined by people around the president. So, the vice president's office, vice president to a degree, maybe unwitting, but never mind. It was undermining, and then of course the office of the chief of staff at the time too, which was Reince Priebus, because there was control of the White House that they wanted. Remember, this is Trump's first presidency, and he didn't really know the ways of Washington D.C., as I said in the movie, and so I firmly believe that he felt like everybody was going to go, okay, tough elections are tough. I'm the president now. Everybody's going to fall in line, and that's anything but the truth, and that never happened. And and here we are with you, Nicole, and we appreciate this. The same thing is happening, but this time, they've learned from their lessons, and they're doing it much more subtly. So, how I felt then was I felt like, oh my God, these people are so corrupt. And I knew what type of person I was. Lori knew what type of person I was. You can't have that kind of a long-term relationship without knowing that. And, we go back to, we were kids at 13 years old, we knew each other. So, that's kind of my
Well, they
take.
started picking at things that you did while you were in the military, specifically the Russia dinner that he went to, and everything all innocent and done by the book, and started picking apart to get the narrative about he was a Russian spy, et cetera. And it was so, we knew it was false and fake, but, try to prove that to anybody else. They didn't believe anything that we would try to say. Mm-hmm. So it was very hard to hear the different, newscasters, articles in the paper by tons of different, journalists that would talk about how he was a Russian spy and, all this stuff, trying to undermine his, achievement of getting picked as the national security advisor. They just didn't want him to get that job. They didn't want him to be that close to Trump, in my opinion. So it was a hard-fought time for us to try to prove his innocence, even though we knew in our hearts that he was innocent, but everybody else, they didn't believe it.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about America in that moment? You must have grave concerns about the state of the nation as you're going through this, because if it's happening to you, they could do this to anybody. This could turn into a Kafkaesque environment very, very quickly. They're going after your whole family at one point.
Right.
And you guys are an emblem of American honor, true honor.
Right.
I think, honestly, and you can address this too, but our family is a really strong family. Not just, her and I and our kids, but my whole family, her whole family.
Right.
And we represent something that, frankly, the left has been attacking for half a century. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea of strong families.
True.
And I do believe that it may be subtle, it may be subliminal, but it is real. And here, our family, we would have taken on the world, and we did. For a period of time, my family, we use the phrase "fight like a Flynn." We took on the world.
It's a great shirt. Do you guys have a shirt?
Yeah, we took on.
Yeah.
We felt like we were taking on the world, and we were ready to do it.
Yes, we were. But it was not easy because, like I said, even friends of ours that we've known for years stopped talking to us. Good friends, people we vacation with, people we worked with.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel exonerated now?
I do, yes.
You do?
But I do want accountability. I want accountability for what they did to him.
Yeah.
because, they ruined his reputation, they ruined his livelihood, they ruined the chance for him to serve with President Trump as the national security advisor.
They changed the course of history.
They did. And so
There's no
for
doubt
me,
about it.
there's no payback for that, except I want some of those people to be held accountable for what they did to him.
Yeah.
American ranchers steward our land. Buying 100% U.S.-born, pasture-raised, and processed meat supports American ranchers and American farmland. That's why I'm glad to partner with Backyard Butchers. Backyard Butchers is delivering quality meat directly from the ranch to your doorstep. All Backyard Butchered beef is certified pasture-raised. This means animals are never confined to a feedlot and are able to roam freely and behave naturally on pastures. This roaming can function as a natural fertilizer and benefits soil and water health. It also tastes delicious. Backyard Butcher's meat comes straight from Texas ranchers where they know the actual rancher and how the meat was raised and processed. They have beef tallow for your skin or your french fries. Check out the Steakhouse box. It's got T-bones, fillets, incredible burgers, and more. There's something every member of the family will love. Backyard Butchers is good, fresh meat raised in Texas the right way. Go to backyardbutchers.com/Nicole and use code Nicole for 20% off. That's backyardbutchers.com/Nicole, code Nicole for 20% off. I'm here with Chloe Cole, who's an activist, and she has a very important message for everybody, not just parents, but young children as well, who might see this on social media and might get a chance to know Chloe and hear her story.
I was about 12 years old when I first started encountering the transgender community, just in the wild on social media.
Yeah.
And I heard the word a few times before. I actually thought it was kind of a funny concept when I was a little bit younger than that. But seeing it for the first time just right in front of me kind of really changed my perspective of things, because these were kids who were very similar to me. I personally was not really interested in the influencers around it. I preferred to interact with or just follow people who were who had smaller accounts because it felt more familiar. But they reminded me so much of myself in so many different ways. A lot of these people were artistic. They were creative. They had a unique fashion sense. They were very individual. They wanted to set themselves apart from the other people around them. A lot of them grew up feeling like they didn't really fit in for whatever reason. Many of them were called tomboys or effeminate boys growing up. And it just something about seeing these other kids my age just going through this and starting out as these awkward kids who some of them were in really bad situations. They were being abused at home. They were being really they're being bullied really hard at school. Which I was bullied. I was totally bullied.
Totally, me too.
And they seemed to find this sense of happiness and wholeness, and they seemed to shine even brighter as they talked about discovering their identity and finding affirmation and cutting their hair short and dressing more like the opposite sex, and people approving of this and calling them by their preferred names and pronouns and everything. And eventually many of them went on to undergo different medical procedures, like the hormones or the surgeries.
What are the names of some of these hormones?
Well, for me, I went on a drug. I ended up going on a drug called Lupron, which I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I've read about Lupron.
It's been used as a cancer drug usually for late stage reproductive cancers, I think, and for conditions like endometriosis. But it's also been used as a chemical castration agent.
Women?
Chemical castration agent for sex offenders.
For
sex offenders of children. But they stopped. A lot of facilities have stopped using this drug to castrate those sex offenders because it's been deemed too cruel for use in that population. Which is very interesting because we're using it on perfectly healthy children like me.
Wow.
I also about a month later went on testosterone.
Wow.
It was I think it was testosterone cypionate. So it was in like I think like an injectable gel, and I took it intramuscularly, pretty much weekly.
Mm-hmm.
And the final intervention that I had was I had an elective double mastectomy to surgically remove my breasts.
Yeah.
And this was not just any like cancer related mastectomy. It's a modified version of that, which is even more invasive. It removes different parts of the tissue. And they don't care as much about like reducing scarring. So you often see patients who have like big, massive scars.
I've seen some of the images. It's
yeah.
a giant line.
Yes. And in my case, I had a type of incision called double incision with nipple grafts, meaning that they cut into each breast, but they also grafted the nipples. So they like took them back off. They took them off, and then the way that it was, so the surgeon described it to me, and they probably simplified it a little bit even because I was 15 years old. I was a teenager at the time that I underwent this last procedure. They would like do like a controlled scrape on the chest, in an area so that they would reposition the areolas into a more masculine looking position.
Oh,
And there's a lot of
yeah.
complications that are associated with
Of
this.
course.
A lot of
Yeah.
people will have their grafts just fall off within
Yeah.
the first few weeks or months. Thankfully, mine didn't. And for the most part, I've healed fairly well from the surgery, but I have had some complications.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing that. I've seen the pictures, and I'm like, that doesn't look like what my friends got, because I'm at
No,
that
it's
age
completely
now
different. It's radically
where
different.
my friends are getting mastectomies, double mastectomies because of breast cancer. And it's usually under the breast,
Mhm.
and they try to leave as much tissue as they can.
Uh-huh.
Um, but this is not that. I mean, what you've just described to me, I have never heard anything like that in my life.
Right. I think that like the grafting of the areolas came from something that they actually sometimes do, in the case of women whose cancer has like not spread to their nipples, and they like
Yes.
graft onto like another area of the body, such as the leg, for example,
Mhm.
for preservation of the tissue. But if you watch videos of how they perform these surgeries, even just the way they perform it looks so careless.
Oh
It's
God.
so careless. They don't really, I feel like just in general, like there is no real care as
Mhm.
to the long-term outcomes of the patients who go through this.
Well, and they're doing it under the guise of, when you wake up and you heal, you will be a man and you won't be a woman anymore.
I mean, so one of the things that really convinced me that I was transgender and like an actual male, I believe that I actually was male
Mm-hmm.
because of this theory of brains being sexed. So it's true that men and women have differently structured brains.
Mm-hmm.
But there was this idea going around at the time while I was in the community that there is like a biological basis to being transgender. And some people have brain patterns that are more like the opposite sex. This has been disproven since, but to like my
Yeah.
little like pre-adolescent brain, it was like, so I'm not just a tomboy. This is naturally just who I am.
Mhm.
And I'm actually a young man. I just happen to have like the sexual developments of a woman. And that's why I feel this
Wow.
distress around my body. It's not just me going through puberty. It's not just me being like a normal, awkward teen. It's because there's actually something fundamentally different around me. And now I have a fix. Now I can finally understand not only myself, but also how I can become better, happier, and healthier.
That is so awful that they were telling young people that the brains were in the wrong body. I mean, that just is such a slap in the face for every hard-headed, stubborn, hardworking, competitive woman. Like, look, even Sex in the City, which was the handbook really for my generation of women, like being like independent women, and we're going to like, have careers, and we're going to have boyfriends, and it's just this like glamorous way of thinking about being a young
Modern
woman.
life, basically.
And even in that one, Carrie Bradshaw has her gay husband, right? And it's
I've never actually watched it, so I feel like I'm like, there's some stuff that I'm missing here.
yeah, I know. Sorry, I'm like definitely aging myself right now. But yeah, and but Sex and the City. That was Carrie Bradshaw has very famously had her gay husband, and it was a friendship because there was this compatibility in the friendship. Like Carrie would help. Oh my God, what was his name? The bald guy with glasses.
There's like an actual
She
term for
would-
that, right? Like a lavender marriage or something.
I don't see all of this stuff became overly literal for your generation. For my generation, it was just like funny, haha, and then for your generation, it all got very literal and scary and medical.
No, it's so
And then
frustrating.
it was
Like
just
I've been in the game for so many years. Like I've been like, I was once a part of like all these communities, right? And it's like, I'm like 4 years out of leaving it, maybe 5. And it's like, there's so many new terms that I can't even keep up with.
Like what are some of them? that you've
Like
heard
a
of
lot of the like
recently?
gender terms. I can't even like keep up with them. Like all the like gender and sexuality terms. Like I've seen some crazy ones out there. Like what is an epicene? What is a nutrius? A lot of it I can't even pronounce because it's so crazy. It's so out there.
Wow. Oh, Chloe, scary. I'm scared. I'm like, I mean, it's just like where are all the mentors?
If you're someone who reads labels and asks questions, especially about what goes into your home and onto your skin, you need to know about Mama Suds. Turns out that all natural, non-toxic cleaning products can have minimal ingredients and work great. We know because we use Mama Suds, which makes all natural, non-toxic cleaning products that work. No greenwashing, no junk ingredients, just effective, safe products, made from scratch with full transparency on their labels. Their laundry detergent soap is a powerhouse. It's residue-free, safe for sensitive skin and cloth diapers. And it cuts through grime without leaving anything behind. And if you haven't tried their toilet bomb cleaning tabs yet, you're in for a treat. Just drop one in, let it fizz, and your toilet practically cleans itself without bleach or fumes. I love brands that do it right, and Mama Suds is one of them. Right now, you can get 15% off your order at mamasuds.com with the code Nicole. Again, that's mamasuds.com and use code Nicole to save 15%.
Joe Allen,
Nicole?
you're an author, you're a researcher, and you're one of the foremost thought leaders in AI, transhumanism, and spirituality, the three of them put together. And there's a lot to unpack here, obviously. But the first thing I think we should talk about is the fact that this is truly a not political thing in the way that we think about the right and the left, because there's transhumanists on the left and there's transhumanists on the right, or what we think of as the right. And so first, what is your definition of transhumanism?
Really simply, it's just the drive or the quest to use science and technology to go beyond the human, to go across the definition of humans as we are now, to go into a future in which we are either human-esque or in the post-human versions, whatever comes out the other end of this great filter isn't human at all. So people think about it a lot of times in terms of cyborgs, right? Like bionic arms or brain implants or laser eyes, and that is part of the mythos. But transhumanism ultimately is a spectrum from what we are now and the technologies used for healing. And as those technologies become more and more sophisticated, using many of the same technologies for enhancement until we are, in fact, something like or many individuals are something like a human subspecies.
here we are in a day and age in which we're looking at medicine, because a lot of transhumanism is happening right now. It
Yes.
is real time. It is happening, and it's happening through medicine or medical needs or addressing medical needs. So, um, but your background is one that I think is important for me to understand and everyone to understand, because if you're 50 years old or 60 years old and you hear about this transhumanism and AI, it's kind of like, you know, that's just technology. I've seen technology advance over my lifetime. You and I are probably similar in age. I was born in 1985. What year were you born?
79.
79. Okay. So we grew up with not really the internet as children. And
Yeah.
then it just kind of all came at the same time as we were teenagers and young adults.
Yeah.
So our brains were pretty well developed before we started having these high definition screens and the internet and all of this information. Now, if you're 25 years old today, you have only known the internet. You have only known technology advancing at rapid speeds. You've only known a world with smartphones. So, what I think is unique about our generation, being a millennial, is that we know what human life was like before technology. And we also know how to use and manipulate technology in a very sophisticated way, because we were young enough to pick it up as it was in its advent. And so we've seen the layers of the cake, right?
Right. Right.
Whereas a 25-year-old has only seen like the top layer of the cake, right? They don't understand all of the foundational technology that had to come first in order to enable this singularity event.
Yeah. They didn't play Atari.
Yes, exactly. They didn't play Atari or that Nintendo duck shooter game. They didn't have the experience of the early Nokia phones. They don't necessarily know pager code language.
Right.
Remember, like how you type numbers in pager code, like "I love you."
Yep. Well, I never had a pager, but yes, I
Oh,
remember the only people who had
yeah.
pagers when I was a kid were drug dealers.
Oh, well, I'm from Oakland, so the kids had pagers too. But I had a
Early
pager as a kid.
adopters.
Yeah. So, anyways, so I think where we are right now is we are in the singularity. In 2023, I was at my conference at Stanford, and Chat GPT had passed the bar exam. Very hard bar exam. And that
Right.
was in the legal tech, legal AI world, a really big deal.
Yeah.
So that was in 2023. Now we're in 2025. And what are you seeing in terms of the singularity? I mean, can you confirm that it's here?
I'm very skeptical of the singularity. For one thing, there's so many different visions of a singularity. There's so many different ways it could go for every transhumanist that believes in the singularity. Many of them don't. There's a singularity for every fevered ego
Mhm.
that thinks that they can see into the future. Classic case, Ray Kurzweil. We always hear Ray Kurzweil has an 86% hit rate for his predictions. I've never seen it broken down. I'm still 2, 3 years in, waiting to see the actual itemized list, but he did definitely foresee certain benchmarks, right, or certain milestones that we are hitting. The prevalence of chatbots, certain advances in medicine. But I think that, for one thing, Kurzweil's vision of the singularity and where we would actually go changes somewhat, like from his Age of Spiritual Machines in 99 to The Singularity is Near, 2005. And then this most recent book, The Singularity is Nearer. There are variations there. So I guess what I'm saying is there is not any hard and fast definition of the
Mhm.
singularity, nor is there a definite there are multiple singularities. There's a multiplicity
Mhm.
of singularities. So, which one is the first question? I actually like the work of Werner Vinge. He is the first to really use the singularity, or at least to look at it in depth. It really precedes him. with a guy, John von Neumann, but Werner Vinci was a sci-fi writer. He died, I believe, last year, very close to Ted Kaczynski, actually. They almost died around the same time. I guess maybe they met at the gates, had a lot to talk about. But Vinci had 6 different types of singularity in mind. And among the most interesting were, in one case, you would have artificial intelligence that was so powerful that it did become the dominant being on Earth, or many artificial intelligences would become the dominant beings on Earth. And because of that, human beings would have no capacity to understand what was happening or any way to control it. Another version of it would be the kind of cyborg or human enhancement version of it, where human beings merged with the technology to the point that those cyborgs would know what was happening for the most part, but us, normal human beings, would have no idea. We would basically be babes in the woods.
Calling all curious minds. Thrill seekers, deep thinkers, debate lovers, story chasers. Those who question everything and those who just love a great read. At Skyhorse Publishing, everything is on the table. And we mean everything. We stand for free thought, bold ideas, and fearless storytelling. Whether it's uncovering the truth, teaching a new skill, or sparking inspiration, we publish books that matter. With 12,000 plus titles in print and 400 more on the way, Skyhorse is one of the most dynamic independent publishers. We challenge the status quo. We bring every perspective to the table, giving readers a place to explore, question, and grow. Want the truth behind the headlines? Read Rand Paul's Deception, The Great COVID Cover-Up. And pull back the curtain on power and public health with RFK Jr.'s The Real Anthony Fauci. Work hard, move fast, have fun, and change lives for the better. That's the Skyhorse way. Go to skyhorsepublishing.com/BTP to learn more. Skyhorse Publishing. Get reading because the sky's the limit.
Dane Wigington, thank you so much for joining me today on Back to the People podcast. Today's topic, for which you've committed your entire life to, is geoengineering. And you are a citizen researcher, journalist, scientist. Would love to touch on your background as well, and really help people understand what's going on with geoengineering. There's lots of talk of chemtrails, and then the retort that comes back is chemtrails are a conspiracy theory. And that's been the method for silencing a broader discussion on this issue. Geoengineering under the work of climate change mitigation is commonly accepted and being pushed across academia. I see investments for it all the time here in Silicon Valley, and government programs all over the world interested in climate change mitigation through geoengineering. But I think we've got to unpack it for folks. But to start, maybe you can explain your background and how you came to start tracking this stuff, and would love to hear that story.
Very grateful for your voice and investigation in this battle, Nicole. And this is a very perplexing issue in that it's the emperor has no clothes moment, that the obvious ongoing operations in our skies that have tainted our formerly blue skies, disrupting precipitation patterns and hampering the ozone layer. I mean, it's a toxic sky, toxic precipitation scenario. That's what got me into this battle. So when I grew up in smoggy Southern California, wanted to get out of that environment, finally made it to Northern California, built a large off-grid home, wind, solar, and hydro in the wilderness on the east side of Lake Shasta. I began to lose 40, 50, 60% of my solar PV uptake, solar power uptake. My home was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. I mean, this is part of my background. And I knew that I couldn't lose 60 or 70 or 80% of my solar power uptake from just condensation. I began to research, Nicole. I was shocked at the amount of data on climate engineering, geoengineering, solar radiation management that existed that I had not seen. I began to test my precipitation, hoping I would not find climate engineering elements in it, starting with aluminum nanoparticles, but I did. I continued my testing over the next 18 months. The levels of aluminum in my rain, and aluminum is toxic to all life forms, by the way, no exceptions. This is bioavailable aluminum. Want to make that clear. Aluminum is abundant in the Earth's strata. It does not exist in free form naturally, period. If it's in free form, it's been mined and refined and dispersed. It's a primary element in climate engineering patents. It was in my precipitation. Over an 18-month period, the amount of aluminum in my rain went from 7 parts per billion to 3,450 parts per billion. That's highly toxic rain. What was I to do but to face this battle? And that's what I did.
Yeah, interesting. So your story is one of a guy who wants to go off grid, who wants to use solar to power your home and your life, and you really became in harmony with nature and started noticing your solar panels were not like capturing as many photons as to be expected. And so it had you perplexed. You started measuring your environment to try to figure out what was going on and started to see abnormalities happening. What year was that?
2002, 2003, in that span of time. And for the record, since that time, so much toxic rain has fallen here, saturating soil microbiome. It has literally changed soil pH values 10 plus times toward alkaline. And I have the historical USDA baselines in my possession. So we have a solid baseline. I got that from a contact on the inside of USDA. So imagine how much material it takes to change soil pH values 10 times toward alkaline, from 5.455 to 6.566. Nothing's adapted to that. It's killing virtually all soil microbiome. There's no soil decomposition here. And we have official agencies blaming all the massive forest die-off, and our forests are completely imploding, not just in Northern California, the entire North American West Coast and most places around the world. And they blame that on beetles or a pest, which are simply, that's a symptom of a sick, dead, dying tree and ecosystem. So again, we have too many agencies trying to protect their paychecks and pensions and not willing to tell the truth, Nicole.
Interesting. Do you think that, it, I'm trying to figure out how to get individuals who have the power to pay attention to how geoengineering is actually causing climate change. It's exacerbating it in ways. It's speeding up drying. And, you know, even in the best case scenario where the goal is to block out the sun, to keep the land from heating, to keep
Correct.
the immediate atmosphere around the planet cooler, because that's
Yes.
their stated goal.
Yes.
And but the problem is that it's not working the way that the science that they're using, or they claim to be using, it's not getting to the solution that they're hoping for. In fact, it's working in reverse. How do we get through to people to show them that the particulates that they're using for cloud seeding are heating and drying our climate? Because that's functionally what's happening, correct?
It is. Your assessment is absolutely spot on. That's exactly what's happening. Climate engineering, under the stated goal of mitigating the thermal energy buildup of the planet, is actually exacerbating it, making a bad situation worse, pushing us from the frying pan into the fire. These are desiccant particles. When you feel atmospheric moisture flows with too many condensation nuclei, the droplets don't combine and fall as rain. It scatters out into an opaque white sky, a featureless white sky, which we now see all the time. And that is the stated goal of, quote, solar radiation management. But as you correctly alluded to, they don't take the consequences into consideration. They never have. So in our groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming,
Mm-hmm.
which has had over 25 million views in spite of extreme social media censorship, in that film is footage of me confronting the world's most recognized climate engineer, Dr. David Keith, at an international conference. And they banned me for that question, by the way, after that was asked from the next conferences. But this shows their mindset, that in that symposium that Dr. Keith gave, stating the objective of scattering tens of millions of tons of aluminum nanoparticles into the sky annually. My question to him was, has any toxicological studies been done, human or environmental? And he first paraphrased by stating, well, there's a lot of particle matter in the sky anyway, a bit more won't hurt. And my follow-up question before they cut me off was, that particulate matter isn't aluminum nanoparticles. Have you studied that? His answer was no. Could terrible things happen tomorrow? We don't know. Of course he knows. Of course they know aluminum's toxic. They simply don't care about the consequences, nor did they with the detonation of 2,400 nuclear bombs, which contaminated everything on the planet. Project Starfish Prime, Project Fishbowl, detonating hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere that they thought could collapse the entire atmosphere. They did it anyway. So that's the kind of mindset we're dealing with, Nicole.
Dr. Joseph Ladapo, thanks for joining me today on Back to the People podcast. As I was just saying, there's a lot of curiosity about who you are. You are a mystery to many of us who have only heard your name talked about as it relates to Florida and COVID and your role as a Surgeon General there, but we don't really know that much about you. And so I wanted to take the time today to kind of go into your background. You are Nigerian born. You came here when you were 5, I read, with your father, a microbiologist. And then you go on to be this all-star Harvard medicine trained doctor. You also have a PhD in health policy from Harvard Graduate School. Tell us about that journey coming here when you were a child.
Well, yeah. So we moved here. I was about 5 years old, and we moved to Louisiana, like Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And my dad was in graduate school at LSU. And as a kid, I mean, well, kids, I guess I should have appreciated that it was a new country and all that. But, at least as I was as a kid, it was just like, all right, what's the next thing? Kids are just into having fun and like what the next activity is or whatever. And I ended up going to elementary school there, and we lived in university housing. So we lived in these apartments with other like student families and stuff. And yeah, it was, I mean, have nice memories from being a kid out there in Baton Rouge and eating crawfish. And yeah, some special things about Louisiana. Louisiana is a special place. So, that was, those are the main things. I pulled a fire alarm once, and I remember being like really embarrassed, I think is probably what I felt. And because everyone had to come out of the buildings and the firemen came. I thought I'd be in big trouble, but I wasn't. So that was good. But I remember that day distinctly.
Well, in the immigrant journey, I was born here, but my mom immigrated, but she didn't immigrate as a child. But when I meet individuals that came here as children, they have memories from where they were born and even like their first few friends. And then the kind of shock of being like, oh, I'm not part of that country anymore. I am now in America. And then you get exposed to American culture, and it's this, it feels really big. Like that was something I oftentimes hear from friends that immigrated, just how big this country is, how um, diverse and complex, and how there's so much to do, and there's all these different states. It just feels very big. What were kind of your memories that you still hold from your time in Nigeria?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. I don't know if I'm abnormal, but I didn't have that experience. I don't know. In some ways, I feel like for a kid, at least for me as a kid, my world was as big as my family and friends and maybe school, and like that was the size of my world, and it wouldn't almost like that would be the size of my world in many countries. When I was as a kid in Nigeria, yeah, I mostly remember my world in terms of my parents and my siblings. And I'm trying to think here. I don't have a ton of memories from back then. I remember breaking a glass table and thinking I'd get in trouble for that. So that, I guess, it was just maybe a recurring theme, times when I think I did something I wasn't supposed to and get in trouble. But I don't have a ton of I don't have a ton of memories from being smaller.
You grew up in Louisiana then, and your father is a scientist. Did he push you into the medical world, or I'm sure you had microscopes all over your house?
I remember a toy microscope from being a kid. Yeah. So my parents, mom and dad, and and it was the in some ways. I mean, now I'm a dad with my wife, and obviously families have to work out however they work out, and the most important ingredient is love. But there is something that tends to be very special about having two parents. And so even my dad was very much the disciplinarian and tried to push all of us toward doing really well in school. And, whether it was a career in in medicine or law or engineering, there were definitely careers that we had in mind from dad, especially as being the you know the point of school and everything. And whereas my mom really, she provided the nurturing mostly. So when both are obviously critical, and she took care of us. She did some teaching with us. Most of that was more with dad. But my mom, I actually remember distinctly being a boy and my mom walking me through this multiplication book, like, sort of multiple digits, how you multiply them. I still remember the book. And she provided more of the nurturing. And, thank the Lord, I had both, and my brother and sister also had both. But yeah, we did have that. I think when I look at other families that are from other countries, it's not uncommon. I mean, in fact, it's probably pretty common when immigrant families come here and mom and dad really push them hard to succeed, 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 and prioritize that over pretty much everything else. So that was definitely my experience, and it certainly shaped Nick. I wouldn't be sitting in this seat if it weren't for many things, but one of those things would be how mom and dad supported me and pushed me.
Yeah, I'm a child of a immigrant from China and definitely was pushed. And there's a little bit of the tiger mom stuff there, but it's you kind of get into that headspace of, failure is not an option. You gotta figure it out. You can make mistakes, but don't make them too frequently. And correct them. Yeah, no, I really think that's what makes this country so beautiful is when we invite families such as yours, that have come here bringing these incredible skill sets, but also families that are built around the American dream. And it's just, I think it's a beautiful thing, and I would love for us to be able to fix all of our border and immigration issues, which are not truly immigration issues. They're border management issues. They're policy issues. They're and so that we can get back to celebrating, this immigrant journey that all so many of us are part of. But what has happened under the Biden administration is not that. It's yeah, it's unfortunate. But now you rose to fame, really national fame, because of your early findings on the lockdowns. You studied the science around the mask efficacy and the mask mandates and school closures. And like Jay Bhattacharya, you came to the conclusion that the federal government had it wrong. Um, and so you came out really early. I still remember hearing about how Florida was going to reopen before any other state did. And that was really under your guidance and leadership. That takes a lot of courage, what you did. A lot of courage. Where did that courage come from?
Yeah. So honestly, Governor DeSantis deserves really all the credit. He was weathering that stuff alone or with Jay's help. I guess in some ways I was providing emotional support in California from the articles I was writing and the Wall Street Journal was publishing. And and it was like kind of a guerrilla warfare where some of us were trying to push out these ideas. And you said it perfectly. The government was wrong. They were doing it wrong. And that was, that was the bottom line. So I'm grateful to Governor DeSantis and for appointing me, of course. And in terms of my courage, I've talked about my own personal experience. We talked about what my childhood earlier in Nigeria, and one of the things that I remembered that I did mention when we talked a little bit about ago was that I was actually molested as a child. I was a victim of sexual abuse and by a babysitter. And and unfortunately, it's tragic no matter what, particularly when it happens to children, because children are developing their mental being and their emotional being and their spiritual being. All those things are being developed, so they have fewer resources to draw on, fewer interpersonal resources to deal with that. Although no one obviously should ever have to deal with that, no matter whatever their age is or any other characteristic. And for me, it happened. I didn't think much of it at all. I pretty much put it in the back of my mind, thought nothing of it. And years later in medical school and in graduate school, I I met my wife and I fell in love with my wife. And anyone who, people who've had the experience of love know that, one of the, love is the most powerful emotion in this galaxy. It's the most powerful emotion and it's the most important one too. And when I had that experience and falling in love with my wife, it it love is like sunlight, right? It's sunlight for your soul. And so all of the things that I had assembled, all of the tools that I had unconsciously, subconsciously developed to cope with that experience that I had as a child that was beyond my ability, clearly to to process as a little boy. All of that stuff became, from the center instead of hiding in the shadows, as those sorts of things tend to do for people, because our mind will put experiences and shape experiences in any way it needs to for our survival.
Wesley Huff. You go by Wes. Thanks so much for joining me today on Back to the People podcast. So I was reading your profile. Wow, what a life you've lived, and what an interesting viewpoint you have on spirituality, Christianity, the human condition. I'm really excited to dig in and ask you some questions about how you've arrived there, but first, to kick off, I have here that you're described as a Canadian Christian apologist, theologian, and scholar. What does a Christian apologist mean?
Yeah, great question. Because what it's not is apologizing for being a Christian, right? So I'm Canadian, so that might come with the territory, saying I'm sorry. But what Christian apologetics is a field and discipline that comes out from passages of scripture like 1 Peter 3:15 and 16, which says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do so with gentleness and respect." And that little
Wow.
phrase in the original language in Greek is pros apologian. So it's the phrase to give an answer or to give a defense or to give a reason. Those are all kind of in the syntactical range of how we translate that into English. And so what we do is we take the beginning of that Greek word, apologia, and we stick an English suffix on the end and develop what we call the field and discipline and study of apologetics, giving reasons, giving answers, giving defenses for the perspective that you hold. So it's typically been associated with historical Christianity. There were early church writers within like the second, third, fourth centuries called the Christian apologists, and they would write these treatises in defense of the Christian worldview. And particularly in things like writing to the Roman Empire and saying, here's why you shouldn't murder us. But throughout history, there have been countless numbers of individuals who could very well be described as Muslim apologists, Mormon apologists. Even you could argue there are atheist apologists out there. It's simply giving a reason for the perspective that you hold. So myself as a Christian apologist, as that being my job description, that is a field that I do when I speak publicly at events, at conferences, on university campuses, and I give reasons. I give the perspective of the coherence and truthfulness of the Christian worldview.
Oh, wow. That's a great explanation. Thank you. How does one become a Christian apologist? Like, is there a track in theology school? Is it through a church? Is it through a sect of the Christian religion? How does that work?
Yeah, so I would say there are kind of two tiers to that. Arguably, if you claim to be a Christian, there's an aspect of you are called to apologetics. In the same way that I would argue that if you identify as a Christian, you are called to evangelism, even though not necessarily having a job with a title like apologist or evangelist. But we are called to make disciples of all nations as Christians. We are called to, as I said before, give a reason for the hope that we have. And so, in the simplest form, if someone knows you identify as a Christian and they ask something as simple as, well, why Jesus? That's an apologetic question. And so, in that sense, that is engaging within the perspective of apologetics. But if you're, say, endeavoring to become a professional Christian apologist, that is a little bit more tricky because I found out very early on when kind of my interests in the defense of the faith, in Christian evangelism, kind of got more fine-tuned was that you didn't graduate from, say, seminary with a theological degree and then take your diploma over to the apologetics factory and apply for a job. It's kind of a winding road in that apologetics, in the same way like something like science, is kind of an overarching discipline. In science, you could be a chemist, you could be an astrophysicist, you could be a biologist or a geologist, and those are very different fields and disciplines. In the same way, Christian apologetics rather, spans the fields of history and science and philosophy and so there's even literature. So there's a broad spectrum. So it's really finding out and figuring out, okay, where is your kind of area of interest? What makes you tick? And then in my regard, it was history and biblical studies, and then figuring out, okay, how does that relate to something like the defense of historical Christianity? So you can take many different paths. There are back doors in terms of studying mathematics, philosophy, science, history. And then there are more direct routes. You can do degrees in apologetics. There are many Christian universities around the world that would supply that, but that would be more of a generalist perspective. Whereas I would argue professional Christian apologists tend to be specialists in one area, and then that's where they speak on authoritatively.
What's your area of specialty?
Yeah, so I'm a historian. So I specialize in both the history of the Bible and early Christianity. I study early Christian manuscripts, so those handwritten copies shortly after the inception of Christianity in the first century. So I specifically look at second and third century Christian manuscripts. Most of those are, say, biblical ones, Old and New Testament, but a lot of other ancient writers that were part of this category of individuals we call the early church fathers also write. And I also evaluate and look at manuscripts in the ancient languages of Latin, Greek, and Coptic in that particular area.
That's really interesting. As you talk about this field of Christian apologetics, it actually reminds me of the rabbinical tradition. And so I've converted to Judaism over 10 years ago. And, going into it, I was learning about the Torah, reading it. I was at the synagogue multiple times a week. I had multiple rabbis that I was working with. And what I loved about Judaism was how intellectual it is and the rabbinical tradition, that there's this constant interpretive relationship with the Torah, which keeps the Torah alive. And for me, because I think I grew up in such a secular way, and it was very much so go to school, learn how to participate in commerce, like get a trade, work. And that was very much my framework for understanding all things, was around self-determination, all of these like very American ideals of individualism. And but I would cross paths with religion along the way, including Christianity. And I always found Christianity to be just this like bubbly, soft, Jesus loving, very simplistic religion. That was my exposure to it, very superficial. And then as I grew up, I continued to intersect um, in my profession, the legal profession, and also just professionally and socially with many Jewish people, and learned about the Torah through a relationship at the time in my 20s, and really was like, wow, the way that I'm understanding Judaism is very similar to how I understand the intellectual exercises in the other areas of my life, that there's interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. But Christianity was not one. I mean, this is actually new to me, that I don't actually understand the intellectual side of Christianity very well at all. I understand, it was only just recently that I understood how the Bible was like it's a collection of stories, and you have the Torah and then the New Testament. I've always wondered why, in the Bible is the Torah called the Old Testament? When was that decision made, and why not call it the Torah?
Yeah, so the Torah are the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament, or what's sometimes called the Pentateuch, which are the laws of Moses, right? So Torah in Hebrew means law, and what we call the Old Testament more formally is what traditional Jews would call the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. So that includes the Torah, the law, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And so the particularly Protestant Old Testament, which is 39 books, is the exact same books as, say, a modern Jewish, if you got it like a JPS, a Jewish Publication Society's
Yeah.
copy of the scriptures. That would be the exact same books as a Protestant Old Testament, but in a different order. So the Jewish Publication Society and historically the Jewish Bible doesn't do things like separate First and Second Chronicles. It kind of it patterns the prophets in kind of a different order, but it's the exact same books. And part of the kind of convening of that was that in ancient Judaism, there was this expectation that God made covenants with his people, these promises, and that there was going to be a new promise. This is capitalized in places like Jeremiah 31:31, where God says that he's going to make a new covenant with his people. He's going to write the law on their hearts, and that not be laws that are inscribed on stone or the written law. And so part of that kind of culmination was the expectation of this individual, the Mashiach, the Messiah, who would come, and he was the anointed one. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, he does certain things which I would argue did they fulfilled prophetic expectations that we see throughout the Hebrew scriptures. And then he establishes the new covenant in particularly the Last Supper, where he sits down with his disciples and he says, "This is the new covenant in my body and in my blood. And then, goes to the cross, dies for our sins, and kind of fulfills those expectations of the one who would, in places like Isaiah 53, he would be pierced for our transgressions, he would be slain for our iniquities. And so we see those fulfillings. And so typically the books have been grouped in an order where, so in Greek, it was the diatheke, which is just the word for covenant. And then in Latin, that word is testamentum. And so it's been associated with the Old Covenant books and the New Covenant books. And so the expectation of the New Covenant coming with the Messiah was that in the similar way that the Jews saw this kind of the expectation of a agreement, a covenant, a promise made with God, followed up by written texts. So we see this, in the Mosaic Law, it's literally inscribed on a tablet. Sometimes in the prophets, you see God saying, write this on a scroll, inscribe this on a tablet. And then the natural implication of there being a new covenant in the promises of Jesus then breathing on his disciples, giving them that authority before he ascends to the right hand of the Father, then the natural question for the early Christians who were Jews, who believed in Jesus as the Messiah, would have been, okay, here's the new covenant, here's the promises, where are the written texts? And so then the culmination of what we call the canonization, the grouping together of Scripture, was the process of looking at how do we recognize the books that are following up those covenantal expectations. And so in that sense, historically, there have been, so within the Islamic tradition, Jews and Christians are referred to as the people of the book, the Al-Kitab. And I think that that's a designation that both Jews and Christians can take on wholeheartedly and say, yes, we are the people of the book. We adhere to these covenantal promises that God has, he has convened with humanity, and he has used them, as Peter says, that men spoke as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. And so then those written documentations become kind of the evidence of what we hold to within these particular traditions. The Hebrew tradition of ancient Judaism, and then the Christian tradition, which is an outpouring of Judaism. It's arguably not a separate religion. Historical Christianity would argue is the culmination of the religion. It's what the Jewish expectation was looking for to begin with.